Hi, this is now chapter 11, and chapter 11 is all about radicals, and 11.1 is about simplifying radical expressions. So, first of all, the word radical is the same as the word square root. So, a radical is a square root. And we have been dealing with perfect squares, which it is still important to know about the perfect squares. So going back to that, we know that 1 is a perfect square because the square root of 1 is 1. And 4 is a perfect square because the square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 16 is 4. So these numbers that are underneath the radical sign are the perfect squares. 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49. So you still have to be very familiar with those perfect squares. Also, there's a couple of rules for working with radicals that we need to know, and that is if I have two separate radicals, like radical A times radical B, I can multiply them together and put them both underneath the radical sign. And likewise, if I'm starting out with two things or under the radical sign, I can separate them to radical A times radical B. Now, let me show you how that works with numbers. If I have radical 12, I can separate that into two things that radical 12 equals, like radical 4 times radical 3. So rad 12 equals rad 4 times rad 3. And when we see a number like rad 12, it is not in its simplest form. So to be in, for a radical to be in simplest form, we have to make sure that there are no perfect square factors. So as we break it down into its factors, we got to make sure none of them are perfect squares. If they are, we're going to simplify them. So no perfect square factors. So rad 12 does have a perfect square factor. Two of its factors are rad 4 times rad 3. So if I was to simplify rad 12, I break it down as follows. I could break it down into any two things that multiply to be rad 12, but it's really good to try to break it down to so that one of the factors is a perfect square, like rad 4. Because then we're just going to simplify rad 4. Radical 4, or the square root of 4, is just plain 2. Rad 3 cannot be simplified at all. So therefore the answer to that problem is 2 radical 3. Now, anytime you're multiplying a radical times itself, another radical that is times itself, this is the second rule for working with radicals that has to be really clear. If I'm multiplying these two, well, I know I can multiply them together and get rad 4. I know I can multiply together and get rad 4, and simplifying rad 4 is just plain 2. Well, likewise, rad 3 times rad 3 times rad 3 equals rad 9, which is just plain 3. When the numbers get bigger, you should be seeing the pattern here that if I was to multiply rad 201 times rad 201, I wouldn't actually multiply those two together. I would just know that the answer is going to be 201. And rad A times rad A will be just plain A. So this is a rule that we're going to use over and over. If you're multiplying the same two radicals together, it equals just plain whatever is inside. So if I had broken down rad 12 to rad 6 times rad 2, I could still simplify the problem, but I'd have to break down rad 6 to rad 2 times rad 3. Just bring down this rad 2. Now I have to simplify this because rad 2 times rad 2 equals rad 2 times rad 2 equals rad 4, which equals just plain 2. So these equal just plain 2, and I have to multiply that by the rad 3. So you'll get to the problem by using any two factors that multiply to 12, but if you use one that is a perfect square, it just speeds it up a little bit. So we're going to do a few more. Rad 90, we want to simplify. So I'm going to break rad 90 to 9 times 10, and it's rad 9 times rad 10. Radical 9 times radical 10. Radical 9 is a perfect square. It equals just plain 3. Radical 10 does not have any perfect squares for factors. It's rad 2 times rad 5, which can't be broken down or combined in any other way, and therefore you can leave the answer as 3 rad 10. Let's try another one. Rad 20. Let's see, this was number 2, and this is number 3. Rad 20, I'm going to break down to rad 4 times rad 5. I'm choosing to use rad 4 because that's a perfect square, and that would equal just plain 2. So the answer is 2 rad 5. Now, in the next example, I think this is the fourth one, in the next example, we're going to multiply two radicals together. We're going to multiply rad 3 times rad 15, and then we're going to simplify our answer. So there's two ways to do this. The first way is I can just multiply those and get rad 45. Now I have to break down rad 45 to simplify it. I'm going to break it into rad 9 times rad 5. Rad 9 is a perfect square. It's just plain 3. So the answer is 3 rad 5. Sometimes, the second way to do that same problem, sometimes I use this if the numbers are big, is that I don't multiply them together. I just break down the numbers. Rad 3 can't be broken. Rad 15 is rad 3 times rad 5. Rad 3 times rad 3 equals just plain 3. So the answer, again, is 3 rad 5. The next example I want to do is, I think this is number 5, rad 2 times rad 8. So this one, the easiest thing to do is multiply it together. Rad 16. Rad 16 is a perfect square. It equals just plain 4. If I hadn't multiplied them together, for this one it would take more work. I would break down, rad 2 can't be broken. Rad 8 could be broken to rad 2 times rad 4. Rad 4 can be broken again to just plain 2. And then rad 2 times rad 2 also equals just plain 2. Then I'd have to multiply those two together and get 4. For this problem, it just was lucky enough that multiplying them together was easier. Number 6, we're going to multiply 3 rad 10 times 4 rad 10. So when we multiply these radicals together, we're going to multiply what's on the outside. 3 times 4 is 12. And then we're going to multiply what's on the inside of the radical. 10 times 10 is 100. 100 happens to be a perfect square. It equals just plain 10. We multiply 12 times 10, and that answer is 120. Okay, I don't know what number this is, but we're going to simplify 120. So I'm going to break it down into any two things that multiply to be 120. I know that 4 goes into 120 30 times. So I'm using 4 because 4 is a perfect square. And 4 breaks down to just, rad 4 breaks down to just plain 2. Now rad 30, we have to see if we can break it down at all. I've got a just plain 2 here. This I could break to rad 5, times rad 6, or 6 times 5. Rad 6 is rad 2 times rad 3. So 30 is just broken down to 2 times 3 times 5. None of those are perfect squares. Nothing can be multiplied together. So I have to just leave my answer as 2 rad 30. Okay, let's now do 4 rad 20 times 3 rad 2. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply what's on the outside, which is 12, and multiply what's on the inside, which is 40. But now I have to break down rad 40. I have this 12 on the outside that I don't want to lose. Rad 40 I'm going to break to rad 4 times rad 10. Rad 4 is just plain 2. 10 breaks down to 2 times 5, which can't be broken down anymore, so I leave it rad 10. And I have to multiply 12 times 2, which would give me 24, and 24 rad 10 is my answer. Okay, now you have to, this is the end of your video, but you have to do on page 844 on the very top of the page, 1 through 4 all. You have to show me those 4 problems tomorrow in addition to all the problems that you did on this video.